Thank you. My name is Ken Barone. I'm a project manager with the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy at Central Connecticut State University, and I'm the manager of the State of Connecticut's Racial Profiling Prohibition Project. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit today about the work that the State of Connecticut has been doing to address the issue of racial profiling, and to walk you through the project that we have put in place over the course of the last 8 years and share some of our experiences and success stories with you. And so the title of this presentation is Racial Profiling, What Does the Data Tell Us? And so just so that we all have a sense of how the next hour or so is going to go, I have about a 10 to 15 minute presentation that I will share with you. Then I will turn it over to our moderator, Andrew Clark, who directs the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy, who will lead our esteemed panelists through about a 40-minute panel discussion, and then we'll be available for, there'll be about 15 to 20 minutes available prior to lunch to answer any of your questions or comment on any comments that you might have. So with that, I'm going to jump right into the presentation. So before I get too into the weeds, I wanted to just make sure we all had a good understanding of the brief history of the state of Connecticut and how we've worked to address the issue of racial profiling. Racial profiling law in the state of Connecticut was first passed in 1999. It is now referred to as the Alvin W. Penn Racial Profiling Prohibition Act, named after the late Senator Alvin Penn from Bridgeport. And in 1999, the legislature prohibited law enforcement agencies from stopping, detaining, or searching any motorist when the stop was motivated solely by the consideration of race, color, ethnicity, age, gender, sexual orientation, or membership in a protected class. An initial study was done in the early 2000s by the Chief State's Attorney's Office. Subsequently, Alvin Penn unfortunately passed away, and the state didn't allow the law, which was supposed to sunset, required the continued collection and evaluation of data for police departments, and they named the law after Alvin Penn. Fast forward now to 2011, 2012, there were a number of law enforcement officers from the town of East Haven, Connecticut, that were arrested for violating the civil rights of, in particular, the Hispanic community, and the legislature looked to the law that they had passed some 12 years earlier and said, hang on a minute, we had a law that should have helped us understand if there were problems in local police departments, and why did the FBI have to come in and arrest a number of police officers for civil rights violations. So the legislature in 2012 rewrote the racial profiling statutes. They put in place a statewide racial profiling prohibition advisory board to help the state guide their work in addressing this issue. The advisory board worked for the better part of 18 months to figure out how to implement the changes the legislature made in the law, and the advisory board still meets on a monthly basis to this day. In 2015, Central Connecticut State University produced its first annual report analyzing traffic stop disparities for all 107 police agencies in the state of Connecticut. You might be asking yourself, why traffic stops? Why do we care about, and why do we focus on analyzing traffic stop information? On average, Connecticut law enforcement agencies conduct approximately 550,000 traffic stops each year. Traffic stops are the most common encounter that law enforcement have with the public. And so if, as a researcher, you want to have a good window into standard interactions or everyday interactions that law enforcement have with the public, gathering and evaluating information on traffic stops becomes a very rich data set to use. And so that's why Connecticut, along with over 30 other states, requires the collection and analysis of traffic stop data from police departments. It's also important to know that issues of race and traffic stops were really brought to the forefront in the 90s as states were initially putting racial profiling legislation on the books, particularly as a result of Operation Pipeline training and tactics, which was really when police were being trained in the development of a profile of a drug courier. And there was a popular belief that police were using race as part of the development of that profile in their fight in the war on drugs. And at the time and today, there were allegations raised by community and media about that the police were profiling non-white drivers, and this became more commonly referred to as driving while black. To date, there are over 4,000 law enforcement agencies across the country that collect demographic information on traffic stops for the purposes of evaluation. So the question, there's really two questions we try and answer here in the state of Connecticut. And the first question is, do racial and ethnic disparities exist in traffic stop data? And we take sort of a unique approach here in the state of Connecticut to how we try and answer that question. We determined that we wouldn't rely on only one way of evaluating traffic stop data. And the reason for that is when we started this work, our 26-member advisory board surveyed the landscape of this research across the country. And what we found was happening in most states is that researchers were coming in and they were looking at traffic stops in a particular community and they were comparing that to some benchmark, typically some census benchmark based on who lived in that community. And ultimately what would happen is researchers would draw some conclusions about whether or not disparities did or didn't exist, and you would have the community feeling one way about the validation of that research, and you would have law enforcement oftentimes feeling another way. And everybody would sort of spend time arguing over the one method that was used, whether it was good, bad, or indifferent. And so we didn't want to get caught in that trap. The ultimate goal of this project is to bring law enforcement and the communities they serve together and to increase trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve so that we could increase police legitimacy. And so rather than relying on only one way of looking at data to determine if racial disparities exist, we decided in Connecticut that we would use 7 different methods for evaluating racial disparities in traffic stop data. And the analysis relies on a host of both descriptive and statistical tests that vary in levels of assumption and levels of scrutiny. But the basic idea of our approach, we sort of call our approach the preponderance of the evidence approach. The idea being that it's possible that one particular methodology being used to evaluate disparities might not be appropriate for a particular police department for a variety of reasons. But if a department continues to show up with statistically significant disparities, regardless of how we look at the data, then we believe that that warrants a further analysis. And so individual departments in the state of Connecticut are run through these 7 tests, and they're identified for further analysis when statistical disparities are identified. And that is also a change in what was typically happening across the country before we started doing this work. Typically, researchers would come in, they would evaluate traffic stop data, they might say, you have a racial disparity, good luck, we'll see you in 3 years when somebody hires us to do this work again. And the police departments and the communities were left spinning to figure out, well, what does this mean? What do we do about the fact that we have a disparity? To what degree are we responsible for the disparity? And so we decided in Connecticut that we didn't want to leave both communities and law enforcement without guidance. And so our process isn't to simply put out a report and point the finger at law enforcement communities, but it's to use our process to identify communities that warrant further analysis. And then we work with those communities over the better part of 6 months, typically is how long it takes, to try and help them understand what are the factors that are driving the disparities in their community. And we have some guiding principles to guide our work, which are really important for us. The first is to acknowledge that statistical evaluation is limited to finding disparities. So we don't ever draw conclusions that law enforcement are engaged in profiling. Data will tell us if disparities exist, and then it requires a lot of work for us to figure out what exactly is driving those disparities. We apply a holistic approach to how we address disparities. as I indicated before, we don't place all our eggs in one methodological basket. And finally, in our reports, if you ever read them, we outline all of our assumptions and limitations. We try and be entirely transparent about the pros and cons of our approach so that people can make their own assessments of the disparities that we've identified. Just some brief highlights. Since 2015, we've produced 4 annual statewide reports, with the 5th one being released in about a month and a half, which evaluates 107 law enforcement agencies. In the state of Connecticut, we have 94 municipal departments, the state police, and 12 special police agencies. Special police agencies being University Police, Department of Motor Vehicle, Department of Revenue Services, as an example. Some general statewide findings over the past 4 years. The race and ethnicity of drivers is a significant factor in traffic stops. Minority drivers are disproportionately stopped and disproportionately searched compared to white drivers. Minority drivers receive different dispositions, so the outcomes of stops, even after we account for the reason for the stop, appears to be different. Police are less likely to find contraband resulting from a search involving a minority driver. Minority drivers are significantly more likely to be stopped for equipment and administrative offenses. These types of stops have historically been considered more pretextual in nature, and officers tend to have more discretion when determining to stop a vehicle for these violations. Since 2015, we've identified 28 municipal police agencies and 5 state police troops that have had statistically significant racial disparities. 10 of those departments have come from Hartford County, 9 from Fairfield County, 5 from New Haven County, 2 from New London County, 1 from Middlesex County, and 1 from Litchfield County. An in-depth analysis is conducted to help each department answer the following question: what are the factors that are contributing to racial and ethnic disparities? And that's the really crux of the work. That's the hard question. It's actually much easier to determine whether disparities exist, and it's much harder to figure out what is driving those disparities. And the follow-up analysis that we conduct does not have a one-size-fits-all approach. It's tailored based on the community's unique characteristics, and we try and consider things such as crime, calls for service, accidents, the department's participation in federally funded enforcement campaigns, officer variations, how officers patrol different parts of a particular jurisdiction are some of the considerations that go into our follow-up work. And so the question becomes where the rubber hits the road, right? I have 3 examples, although I want to make sure we get time to our panel, so I want to just provide to you one example of something that we've learned in a real anecdotal way that I think illustrates the power of data. And so I'll use my Newington example. A number of years ago, we had identified the Newington Police Department with statistically significant disparities. And we met with the department and we drilled down on the data. And one of the things we noticed was that they were the leading department in stopping cars for equipment violations, particularly defective lighting. And so they stopped more cars for defective lights as a percentage of their overall stops than any other department in the state. And that was predominantly impacting Black and Hispanic drivers. And so in our conversations with the department, we tried to understand this enforcement strategy. And what the department told us was that it was part of their roving DUI patrol. And so you send law enforcement out during peak drinking hours and you have them look for low-level violations as a way to interact with drivers to determine if they have been drinking. And it's a good way to say to the driver, where are you coming from, where are you going to, have you had a drink this evening? If not, hey, by the way, your brake light or tail light is out, you should get that fixed and have a nice day. And so as I sat there and listened to the explanation, I understood that it seemed very logical. So the question was, we know that the enforcement strategy is causing a fairly significant racial disparity in their data, but are the outcomes warranted? Meaning, are they finding a lot of drunk drivers and getting drunk drivers off the road? And what we determined was that out of the 1,608 traffic stops they made in a 12-month time period, for defective lighting, they had only found one drunk driver. And in fact, they had found significantly more drunk drivers in speed enforcement and in other types of safety-related enforcement. And so some of what we did is work with the department to address that and to craft a strategy that would allow them to effectively solve their problem, which is concerned about public safety and intoxicated drivers, while reducing, if not eliminating, their racial disparity. And when the department changed the way in which they did DWI enforcement, what we saw was a drastic decrease in their racial disparity the following year, and they haven't been identified subsequently. So that's just some of the work that gets done in the follow-up. And the last slide I'll share with you is just some of the really important lessons that we've learned. We're now significantly more informed since the changes in this law took effect in 2013 about the factors that drive disparities in policing. Data is a very powerful tool that can and currently is being used to make both policy and legal changes. And the thing I'll leave you with is the old phrase, slow and steady wins the race. And that is that we have been at this work now for the better part of 8 years. And every year we're sort of chipping away at addressing disparities in departments. And it's for the first time, this is a quote out of the report that is soon to be released, the findings from the 2018 analysis of Connecticut's traffic stop data indicate that progress continues to be made in terms of the decision to stop a minority motorist. The results from the Veil of Darkness analysis, that's one of our leading analytical tools for assessing disparities, indicates that a stopped minority motorist was not more likely to have been a minority during periods of daylight relative to darkness. So what that means is it's the first time in the 5 years that we've put these reports out where we didn't identify a significant statewide disparity in the stopping of minority motorists. That doesn't mean there were no disparities. It means that the disparities have significantly decreased over the course of the last 7 years. And so as folks are thinking about and considering ways to address racial disparities in their own part of the criminal justice system, I just leave you with this note that it doesn't happen overnight. It requires focus and consistent work and teamwork and everybody being sitting around the table and being a part of the conversation and the solution. So with that, I'll be happy to answer questions after the panel discussion about the work we've done. I'm going to turn it now over to Andrew Clark, the director of the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy, to guide us in a discussion.